Welcome to Money and Meaning, a podcast where we connect with people around the world who are working to unlock the power of markets for impact. I'm Tova Lobatz, COO of SOCAP Global. This podcast series is hosted by SOCAP Global and the Sorensen Impact Institute. SOCAP Global convenes the largest and most diverse community and impact through live and digital experiences that educate, spur conversation, and inspire investment in positive impact. We work under the leadership of the Sorensen Impact Institute, which helps organizations achieve their impact vision. The Institute is proudly housed at the University of Utah's David Eccles School of Business. Each episode of Money and Meaning features stories of amazing people who are leveraging the power of capital markets to better people and the planet in a just and sustainable way. This episode of Money and Meaning is a conversation between David Bank, founder and editor at ImpactAlpha, and Mark Davis, CEO of TableSense. Based in the Heartland, TableSense brings together the tools of impact investing, research, and policy to create systemic, financially sustainable, and politically durable solutions in the child welfare space across the U.S. This episode touches on the opportunities of child lens investing, which Davis describes as reducing drag on the economy through investing in human potential through proven, practical services. Enjoy the conversation.
Mark Davis, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
This is a special podcast. You and I met at SOCAP, and we had a terrific conversation, as happens at SOCAP, about TableSense. And as I understand, it's all about kids. So tell us what's up.
Yeah. Our mission is to help kids. You know, we're based in the Heartland, Cincinnati, Ohio headquarters. But as we were just discussing, these are national issues, and we're trying to attack them at a state by state level. And it's all about, bringing together the tools of impact investing, hence this podcast, of course, as well as some research and policy work. And we really believe that when those things come together is how we can create some true systematic, lasting change and create things that are a lot more financially sustainable and politically durable.
Yeah, sometimes people say, explain it to me as if I'm a 5-year-old. I understand you did explain it to your 5-year-old.
Yes, I did, and it didn't go as I expected, but in such a beautiful way. So I've been in this industry here for a bit. I began my career in this space. I was originally an accountant, learned a lot of great stuff, but moved on. And the story that we're just talking about was I was a new CFO at a company called NECO, NECCO. Foster care, adoption, mental health services, neurodivergent IDD, lot of great things across multiple states, and it was an important job, stressful job, and because it was still a job, right? And my son asked me, hey, Dad, what's your job? He's a 5-year-old kid driving home from practice, and I'm sitting there probably overly focused on my ego and not wanting to sound like a bookkeeper. So I'm talking about, resource allocation and strategy and this thing called impact investing and a double bottom line and all this stuff. And so 24 hours later, we're sitting, on my couch in my house with my, roughly 5-year-old son and, playing video games, whatever we're doing. And just goes out of the blue. He's like, hey, Dad. I was like, hey, what's up, bud? And he goes, you help kids, right? And that was it. I mean, and I literally kind of melted a little bit. And that was when I was like, really, I think, bought in. And I think it's important for anybody who's been, in this social enterprise, impact investing space. It can be, you have all the normal stressors of a job, right? But you also have this crushing, dream of changing the world and making it different. And sometimes you kind of have to ground yourself in what a privilege it still is to be able to do that every day, as opposed to just cranking, widgets out. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And in particular for the next generation, as you say, and I like that as the investment thesis, kids, because you're making an investment, but then it's paying off, obviously for them, but also for everybody else. I mean, you're kind of paying it forward for society in a sense, as these kids grow up, and take their own place. So, just tell us how you sort of think about that, kind of broad kind of, mega trend in a sense of child lens investing. Some folks call it sometimes.
Yeah. So, and I had the privilege of catching up with Christina Shapiro at UNICEF USA very recently. We met also at SOCAP several years ago, she and I, when they launched their initial framework, and have kept in touch, but not enough lately. And it's funny. we've kind of arrived at the same place in some ways, coming from very different vantage points. So for those that are unfamiliar, UNICEF is a very large, complex international organization. There's a lot overseas too, and kind of the roots of us and Table Sense and my background is much more domestic and more kind of at a provider direct service level. And after both of us kind of being on parallel paths from a different vantage point, we're all kind of aligning to the need to really do some ecosystem building work and building out the infrastructure. I mean, there are, and we'll probably get into this, some shovel-ready opportunities for sure to invest in that do have a payback, but there's still so much more room to do more. And this is an area that there's not a lot of people talking about yet. You see a lot of hype around other impact themes that, for whatever reason, have attracted more attention. And this is fairly ubiquitous. It's like a hidden population. I think that is also what impacts the lack of perceived opportunity with youth. But I mean, the last thing I'll just throw into that is that the opportunity is very real in a very, very economic way. There's been research that's been done. In fact, several studies by economists that have essentially, in layman's terms, have quantified the drag on the economy. So how much higher would the GDP be, the gross domestic product be, if it were not for child poverty? And the answer is our GDP would be about 5% higher. And that's for the combination of cost avoidance and, again, the opportunity cost of higher wages and all those things. And that's a pretty big number. That's about $1 trillion. That's not a small number. And that's not what it takes. That's what we get. And that's every year. So, this is a problem that's worth solving. It's a big market, and we got to get more people coming to the table, as it were, to help solve them.
And so just, sort of sketch for us, how that gets recycled back into opportunities. You talked about, very bread and butter kind of services. They're chronically underfunded, as you know very well. And yet they have huge payoffs. So, what's the strategy to sort of pull all this together?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing here is really leaning into, pick your phrase of the day. Pay for success, performance contracts, performance-based contracts, all that stuff.
We used to call them social impact bonds, but that kind of went away. But pay for success, I think, has stuck around. Yeah.
So whatever flavor of the idea that is not particularly novel in most of the economy, do a good job, you get paid more at the end through a bonus, an outcomes-based, bonus. Therefore, the payer, the government, in many cases, is willing to fund more because it's tied to outcomes. So that is a really, really critical, I think, thematic issue for us. And so that's on the longer term, strategy horizon. There's some people who are doing work. Make Home Capital is a great group, for example. They were on the panel we hosted at SOCAP, actually, and they're private credit fund that's doing some cool stuff there.
That would be what's called an outcomes fund, as you say, with
correct
with milestones and performance metrics that determine the return and sort of make align up the impact with the returns.
That's right. Yeah. So that's an important, I think, change tool for a lot of government funded human service oriented things. And then there are, of course, a lot of children, related and young adults. I should clarify too, we're really focused actually predominantly on the teenage to young adult transition. There's a lot of work needed at all stages, but, from a policy perspective, what happens is, these youth that come from a disadvantaged background, there is a literal cliff. They literally fall off. And as an example, foster care, is one that we're familiar with pretty well. And, I've seen some research that says as much as 20% of former foster youth become homeless the day they turn 18.
Because the subsidies and the support goes away. And then most 18-year-olds, and I know from my own experience, are not necessarily ready to be on their own at 18. If they're from other kinds of backgrounds, they might be in college with all kinds of support or other kinds of systems. But foster kids are somehow expected to sort of make their own way as soon as they reach maturity.
Yeah, and the tragedy is there are opportunities and there is funding even at a federal level, even in today's climate. In fact, that's been from the White House. They've actually doubled down on this. So there are federal programs and funding for that population, but due to something as tragic as miscommunication to something a little bit more profound, if you have a group of people that have been in the system or institutionalized, and they're I'm an adult now, I don't need help. And they do need it. And that's some of the work we've been, doing alongside with some of our peers in that space. So I think I'm very, very, bullish on the social impact opportunity there and a true double bottom line if the right work is done there.
So-called transition age youth, I think, is the term of art, if I'm not mistaken. And it goes all the way up to 25. So these are young adults who are coming into the workforce and coming into their own, independence. So what kinds of things are we talking about? What would be helpful?
Yeah, well, I'll maybe just keep kind of replaying back to that panel at SOCAP where there's another group, great organization, Jobs for the Future, and they are not they're not a children's fund, but there's a children's strategy. They're a young person strategy. So as the name implies, they are very focused on that kind of earn to learn, pipeline, doing a better job reconciling the, constantly evolving dynamic needs of employers with the young people that, are having, challenges. Again, could be from a child wealth system perspective. It could be just a simply, a disadvantaged background. And so that's a venture capital fund. And they're, doing some great work. They're building some solutions that really strike at that. And I think back to one of your earlier questions, like what's kind of that through line of strategy here. I think the private sector marriage is a major opportunity. And thinking about how can we align, there is a lot of need for more healthcare, mental health services and all of that. But we also have to be thinking about, the foundational building blocks, the hierarchy of needs. And one of those is earning a living wage. We cannot ignore that. If we do everything else but that, we will not be successful long term. So you've got employers that are desperate. I mean, certain industries, especially for those that are more trade oriented, so you're starting to see this more with like micro credential programs and apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeships. And there's been, again, some studies on ROI for those programs where you've got, 2x or more return on investment in return in terms of the social return relative to the investment. So I think that's another really, really important area where we can be playing.
TableSense both makes its own investments, impact investments, and then you're also playing at kind of what people are now calling like a systems level, like with to try to affect the whole marketplace, the whole ecosystem. Tell us how you sort of see the different levels.
Yeah, I would say somewhat grudgingly playing in that landscape, or resistance, maybe a better word to put it, because I think you can get bogged down in trying to, become this omnipotent, I see all, know all, I can understand how all these highly complex systems work. And the reality is nobody can, but you have to lean into that a little bit, here. And I really think about, the process of innovation and how different innovating in a human service field or social sector is than to maybe other areas. And I'll do another Cincinnati reference, a guy by the name Gary Painter, who's done some work on social impact bonds. He and I have been talking about some of the work he's doing at UC to build a kind of a social innovation, lab where it's a lot more clear how you can bring a new solution to market, if you will. So if you contrast that with something, which sounds absurd, but think about nuclear energy. In the night, and go back, many decades. There was a point where nuclear energy was just a concept that only a handful of people even had on their mind, and then how that's evolved over the years, and how much there was government funding that was put into that to develop the technology and to commercialize it. And then, for the early pioneers of investing in that technology, you had to engage in policy and regulatory reform. So that process of innovation and innovating in a highly regulated, government-funded, typically, again, I think there's opportunities where you can go beyond government funding with the employers, for example, but that's the meat of it, is government-funded stuff. So how you innovate in that space is going to be very, very different than just simply, launching a new tech-enabled startup and praying for the best. So that process is something that I really feel like we got to do more of with and I do want to clarify, I'm not saying that nuclear energy is or is not an impact investment. I'm just simply saying, reflecting on the difference in the mindset compared to many, I think, incumbent impact investors.
Yeah, that nuclear story is kind of a hot button, but let's not go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But on children, also you're saying a lot of the action is at the state level. Obviously, people sort of track what's going on in Washington, but states are the laboratories of democracy, laboratories of innovation in a lot of cases. Who's doing something interesting?
Well, that's a great question. I'm actually down in the great state of Georgia as we speak, doing some work down here. And I think that the big point onto your question about who's doing something interesting is not which state, it's which coalition of groups and what states are more receptive to, building an alliance, if you will, and a coalition with the private sector, with the community nonprofits, and it was really fascinating to hear what the Atlanta Foundation is doing, actually, with some loan guarantees, and that was unfortunately more of a in response to some of the funding concerns and the government shutdown. But I think that loan loss guarantee and how that can help create some release valve, because what happens. It's a complicated system because, yes, policy on a state level matters, but federal funds do flow until they don't. And that puts an incredible amount of pressure on states. So that was that. And you've seen things like that where some of the community foundations have stepped in. I think that's really cool to see. There has been some legislation that's been percolating more and more around. You call it performance-based contracts. It could be pay for success, but it's again that same basic fundamental idea of how do we identify quantifiable outcomes that generate savings and share that savings with the providers generating it.
Let's just pause on that, because that, I think, is the crux of the matter. And we've been hearing a lot about these kind of collaborations where if you as they say, sort of make the problem bigger or sort of zoom out a little bit and you can kind of see a bigger landscape, you see that there are people who pay for these kinds of outcomes, whether it's hospital systems or insurers or Medicaid, of course, or and that want better outcomes for kids and for communities broadly, and would be very well positioned to finance those and, in fact, save money, as you say, because that upstream prevention is going to be much cheaper than the downstream remediation of the harmful impact. So the question is sort of how to orchestrate the whole thing where those capital flows go back to the places where the investments are needed.
Yeah, and that's like such a deep topic. And I think, again, it pushes into that systems level work. There was a federal bill that was passed many years ago, and it was meant to address what some people call the wrong pocket problem. So the bill was called SIPRA, SIPPRA, I believe. And it took a while to roll out, but the spirit's phenomenal. One of the root issues, again, back to the idea of innovation. So if you're negotiating directly with a Medicaid managed care plan, it's a little bit easier. You've got a quasi-commercial entity that can make decisions quicker, and it's bearing the risk and the reward, financially. But then if you get into something where you're hitting, this intervention affects the juvenile justice system and the adult, Medicaid, population, and the foster care, funding, and fill up 2 or 3. All of a sudden, you've got 6 or 7 different payers, government payers, that you have to, kind of corral, and that is some of the systems mapping work that needs to continue to occur. And we actually are in the process of closing down on a deal. One of many to commission some longer term research around mapping those flows, both, what are the interventions and the cost savings, but also, who's paying for those interventions up front and who's reaping the rewards. So if you get into this wrong pocket problem, that if you're negotiating with the person who's the payer, who is bearing the responsibility of the investment, but they don't reap the rewards, they don't have any economic incentive to cut a deal. So that's a really, really important area for us, especially for again, that transition age. So you go from being an adult or child to an adult, all of a sudden it all flips again. So but it's all there. That's why you mentioned zooming out. And that's why I go back to that overly, bombastic sounding GDP number. Let's start with that and work our way down.
Let's take it down to cases. I know you have done a lot of work with supportive housing for young adults. And that's been, housing is at some level one of those sort of fundamental, as you said, Maslow's hierarchy of need in terms of being able to be settled and safe and secure and get the rest of your life in order. How is the supportive housing market for young adults?
It's a really interesting opportunity. We've got a lot of ways to go, but the opportunity is there. So, in no particular order, there is, for example, and this again is something that the White House has been very emphatically continuing to endorse, is a little known program called Foster Youth to Independence, or FYI, housing vouchers. And that is for, as the name implies, for former foster youth who need some rental assistance for a period of time. Most states have not been able to tap into most of those dollars due to really logistical issues. But that is a steady cash flow, if you will. If you think about underwriting a project, that's one example where the cash is there. We just have to do some of the hard work of helping the states and the departments get the cash out the door to finance the projects. One of the unique things about this population is that there's an opportunity here to get away from the traditional, very, very large multifamily, LIHTC or low-income housing tax credit finance projects. There's a place for those, but probably more often than not with this population for a whole variety of reasons. So there are some other programs out there at a federal and then that flow through to the state that again provide, whether it's TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, there's Chafee dollars again for former foster youth, and on and on and on, and mapping that out because the developers, they don't understand this, right? This is not their core competency. So we've been doing a lot of bridge building across sector, essentially to educate people on the opportunity. Then you have providers, those that are working directly with the youth, where they are often beholden to a very limited number of landlords that are willing to work with those populations. So they're paying maybe above market rent in some cases, and or they are forced to operate in areas where those youth, those adults that they're working with are cut off from transportation and access to the job market is more difficult, or childcare, again, those foundational building blocks. So if we can, and we're modeling all this right now, bring all those players together again to the table and build kind of a true partnership around that.
Well, I can see why you're the go-to guy for folks who want to know the nuances and the opportunities. What's in the pipeline, and how can people learn more?
Yeah, so in the pipeline is certainly that, what I just referenced. And I will have to give a shout out to a group called Good River, who was also on our panel at SOCAP. They've also been doing some good work there. So some more to come on that. I mentioned research. I mean, we've got quite a few things in the pipeline there as well. We really believe that there's some basic foundational survey work we could be doing. There has been some great work over the last decade around building youth advisory boards. But those tend to be very qualitative in nature, and they don't rise up to the scale of the problem. They're very localized. So we are beginning to build out much more of a broader based survey tool. And then the last thing, we are really, and we're looking at a couple opportunities in our pipeline from an investment perspective on this, that are more on the tech side. There's a lot of talk about impact measurement, and has been for years. What's a little bit different take is, what about investing in a social enterprise that actually within its embedded as a business model, creates this data. So research traditionally is a cost, and it's expensive and it's slow. And if you can find a way to, wrap this around, like a kind of rapid response survey, kind of gamified tool that helps people navigate the system, we're getting a much more real-time data. We can actually intervene quicker. And, that's another thing we're looking at. So a lot coming. We're kind of breaking our stealth mode recently. We've only been at this about a year. And I think 2026 is going to be a big year for us.
Well, terrific. I finally figured out table sense and how you put that name together, and kitchen table and common sense.
That's right.
And those are certainly front and center in 2026, as you say, and particularly for kids. So thank you, Mark Davis, and we'll be checking back and seeing how it's all going. But thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Money and Meaning. If you were inspired by the conversation and are interested in getting more involved with the SOCAP community, join us at the next SOCAP. Learn more and register at SOCAPglobal.com. Be sure to subscribe to Money and Meaning wherever you get your podcast to be notified of our next episode's release.